Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Kos The Brief. It's our weekly show about politics. I'm Marcos Molitzis. I'm here with Carrie Eleveld. And today we're going to be talking about the same topic we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, which is abortion rights, the Supreme Court, and its effect on the 2022 election. 2 weeks ago, we had Christine Pelosi. We talked about sort of the messaging side of things. And the decision was hours old. Not the decision, the draft decision was hours old. Then last week, we actually talked to Christina Randall of Emily's List. And we talked about the $150 million that they are spending in the 2022 elections, along with NARAL and Planned Parenthood Action Fund, to center abortion rights in this election cycle. Carrie, we've talked about how so many prognosticators have sort of written this election off, for the Republicans, right? Because of history, because of Joe Biden's approval ratings. And we've been saying this Supreme Court decision is going to shake things up. And it's still early, right? We're still talking about 2 weeks after the draft decision. We don't even have the final decision yet. And I think we're already seeing things shook up. So today we're going to keep talking about that. We have Senator Emily Randall of Washington State. She represents a district she won by 104 votes out of 70,000 cast 4 years ago. Ooh. She represents a exurban district. So rural, there's a little bit of urban areas in there, but it's mostly an urban district. She barely won it. She's going to talk about what people are saying to her as she knocks on doors. We're also going to be talking to Matt Hildreth, who is the executive director of Rural Organizing. And we've had him on the show a couple of times to talk about the importance of eating into the Republicans' massive margins in rural districts. Can choice help us do that? Or is this just going to make things that much more difficult in those rural districts? So we're going to be talking to both Senator Emily Randall and Matt Hildreth. And Carrie, you've been on this beat. You've been hardcore on this beat. And I think it's the beat. I think this is going to decide November's election.
Yeah, I mean, either this, right, agreed. I mean, I think, either this, I think what people are underestimating is whether or not this will turn, they always think about persuasion and they don't, and weirdly, I know this is like, everybody's always like, it's all about turnout, but then you hear people, they're like, I don't know, I don't think this can trump inflation, but I think there were people who show up at the polls that wouldn't have showed up at all. We're not talking about persuasion. We're talking about, I do think that it will give some voters pause in suburban swing districts where they might have just said, I don't appreciate still the way the country's going, maybe I should give those radical Republicans a try. I mean, I have no idea. I can't imagine saying that myself, but for some people, but then they see this and they think, wait a second. What about my kid? What about my daughter? What kind of, world, what kind of country do I want them to grow up in? What kind of rights do I want them to have? I mean, these are things, inflation is not forever. I'm not saying it doesn't hurt. I'm saying like it's going to go away at some point, and hopefully Democrats can come up, can help it make it go away quicker, or but the losing your rights doesn't go away for a long time. You're just stripped of them, right?
So to provide a little bit of context, you talk about persuasion, and I just want to make sure people understand that when campaigns are sort of modeling their voter universe, there's two real sort of main approaches. One, you can persuade your base to turn out. So it's persuasion. You can persuade people to vote your way that may not otherwise vote your way, right? That's persuasion. You're convincing them, this person might have voted Republican, but you made that argument. You made that killer argument, and they're flipping. And that doesn't happen very often anymore.
Right.
Just does not happen. The other one is sort of base motivation, is you get the people that already support you and you make sure that they turn out and vote. And there's this ages-old battle between sort of the consultants and activist class, where the consultants are obsessed with changing people's minds. And Matt Hildreth is in that world, right? He wants to persuade world voters to not be like 85-10 Republican, maybe 70-30, right? And Democrats are in a good place then. He wants to eat into that.
He wants to lose by less.
Yeah.
He wants those districts, right?
Then there's the base people, and that say if only everybody was like Bernie Sanders, then people would be really motivated to turn out and vote. And there's this sort of like, which one's better? And of course it's both, right? I mean, you don't have to pick one over the other. And this is something we talked about with Matt Hildreth before on the show, is that to win a bigger share of the world vote doesn't require Democrats to compromise their core message. That's his core argument. And it'll be interesting to hear what he says, because now if abortion rights is our core message heading into November, how does that play with world voters? And can we use that message to chip away at that sort of Republican monolith in rural America?
Right. So let me just talk real quick about some of the polling, right? Just because we are seeing this issue and how people are thinking about it is changing in real time, right? Which it makes watching it sort of extraordinarily interesting. So, for instance, NBC News just had a poll out yesterday that showed because it showed that and it
was Monday. Let's say Monday, so people are listening at different times.
Monday had a poll out Monday. You're right. That showed that what some other polling has showed that there's an uptick in support for abortion rights, right? So it reached an all-time high in that poll, which is, you want to compare a poll to its own polling from year to year to year. So it reached an all-time high in 20 years since 2003 to 60% support for abortion rights, right? 63% support for maintaining the Roe v. Wade decision. But interestingly, the number of Democrats expressing a high level of interest in the midterms, either a 9 or a 10, jumped 11 points since March to 61%, right? And awesome. I think that is,
where are Republicans at? Do you have that in front of you?
Well, so they're at 69%, but they only got a 2-point bump since the leak. So their march to now they were at 67%, and now they're at 69%. So that significantly closed that gap. It's an 8-point gap now.
Which is still a problem. Let's not pretend otherwise.
It's still a problem.
We're 2 weeks out from the decision.
But it was a double-digit gap before, right? So we're seeing the voters talk about the Supreme Court. And there's just been a collapse in trust and confidence in the Supreme Court. Navigator Research, which is a progressive consortium of pollsters, found for the first time in polling last week, plurality support for expanding the court, for changing the makeup of the court. So, we don't need to get into a debate over whether or not that can be done and how it can be done. What it says is people understand that the court is now out of whack. It's out of step with the majority, and they're looking for ways to, potentially change that. That was the first time Navigator had found that, just like, NBC was finding a record high in the for the first time in 20 years in support for abortion rights. So sometimes it's not really the number that counts so much as where the trend line is moving, right?
Yeah, it's got to start somewhere, and we were clearly lagging as the numbers you state indicate, and we've come this far in 2 weeks, and I think that's a big reason that Republicans are so pissed that the leak happened. They should be celebrating, right? If they thought this was good for them, it would be, it would be all out celebration. But very few are, right? I mean, Mitch McConnell, he's still complaining about the leak. And that's because they just gave Democrats a heads up in organizing around this decision that is going to be coming in the next month or so. So we would have had to wait that month. Now already people are engaged, people are active. And again, we'll be talking to Senator Emily Randall about what she's seeing on the ground in her very tough competitive district, because it seems that it is definitely scrambling the race. And I feel more and more that if we're seeing this kind of intensity right now, it's going to be exponential when the final decision comes through. And then it's an all-out sprint, Carrie. I mean, it's
really interesting watching Republicans. I just want to mention 2 points real quick. Number one, the Republican position is evolving. They're like scared of this issue. Initially they were like, oh, this won't matter. We're really ticked off about the leak. And then it was, this won't matter. It won't, it's not on a par with inflation. And now they're really using gentle language. Like Mitch McConnell said, oh, I think it'll be a wash. He tried to argue in an interview that supposedly this was good. He's like, this is a state level issue. It's going to make a difference in the states, but it's not going to, it's in state level races. But
where's the Senate races fought?
I know exactly. He's like in the federal,
the whole separate
races.
thing.
Yeah, it's a whole separate thing. I just think it's going to be a wash. As if someone's going to go, in Pennsylvania and vote for governor, Democratic governor gubernatorial candidate Josh Shapiro, the current attorney general, and then decide, but I think I'm going to take a vote for whoever it is that wins today in the, Republican. And speaking of Pennsylvania, oh my God. Okay, so I could just, but
yeah, we should have a whole show on Pennsylvania.
That is happening right now today, right? That runoff, that primary, GOP primary between like David McCormick and Oz, Dr. Oz, who was endorsed by Trump, and this like up and comer Kathy Barnett, who's just woo.
She was marching with the Proud Boys on January 6th.
Yeah. So that primary is happening today, but the final week of their whole primary happened in the wake of this leak, and so it became this whole, I'm more pro-life, I'm more like crazy pro-life. No one's gonna get an abortion on my watch. Like this race just to the right, to the hardcore conservative right.
And when you talked about 60% of Americans supporting abortion rights, did you have the number in front of you, what that number is for how many oppose it? Because it's not going to be 40%.
No, it wasn't, but it was. So that was 60% support for having it be legal in either all or most cases. But it was 37% support for having it be illegal in most cases, or with no exceptions. Basically, somewhere around 5% of the country believes there should be a total abortion ban with no exceptions whatsoever.
All right, so that's where those guys are sitting. They found the most fringiest pocket, and they're out there. But hey, let's talk to our guest about this, because it sounds like our guest opponent might actually be one of those people. So today our guests are Senator Emily Randall of Washington State. She was born and raised in the Kitsap Peninsula, the legislative district she now represents. She was first elected to the Washington State Senate in 2018, where she won by 104 votes out of 70,000 cast. That's mind-blowing. We also have Matt Hildreth, who grew up in a small farm in eastern South Dakota and now lives in rural western Washington, I think probably somewhere near Emily Randall, and he is the executive director of ruralorganizing.org. Guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks
for listeners, it looks like Matt Hildreth has a drum set in the background. So at the end of his time here, we're going to ask him to just serenade us with a little, few drum hits.
Yeah,
piano behind me, so we can do an impromptu jam session.
Love it. I'm all for that.
So, Senator Emily Randall, tell us a little bit about your district. We're going to talk about abortion rights, obviously, but tell us a little bit about this incredible district that you just barely won by the skin of your teeth 4 years ago.
Well, the 26th, I'm biased, but the 26th is one of the most beautiful places in the country. It's across the Puget Sound from Seattle. You can take a very scenic ferry ride to get to our district. It includes the cities of Bremerton and Port Orchard and Gig Harbor, and then a lot of rural area in South Kitsap County, in the Key Peninsula and Pierce County. Our biggest employer is the government. The Puget Sound Naval Shipyard is in our district, so a lot of civilian folks working for the Navy. It's a working class district with certainly some wealthy pockets, but it feels like a little bit of a microcosm of the country. You know, folks in rural areas, folks in suburban areas, folks in little pockets of city who are just trying to, you know, build the best lives they can for themselves.
So one of my close friends is Joe Sudbay, who interviewed you recently, and this is how I got a hold of the idea. But it sounded like, tell us what it was like for you in mid-March when you started knocking doors, and if that has changed or how it's changed since the leaked Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, good question. So, I started knocking, like you said, in mid-March, just days after our legislative session ended. And the most common issues that folks raised at that point were, kitchen table economic issues, gas prices, food prices, housing prices, dealing with inflation, some community safety issues that I think a lot of our communities are grappling with. But it was like night and day when, the day after the leaked opinion, all folks wanted to talk about was Roe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that continuing?
Yeah, it's eased a little bit, and it changes depending on which neighborhood you're in. I think our news cycles are so fast these days that, the pressure is not always as high, but it definitely has come up way more often, yesterday, the day before, than folks were talking about reproductive rights, in middle or late March.
When you talk about this is what they're asking for, what's the feeling? I mean, this is a 50-50 district. This is the epitome, like you say, the microcosm of America. And we are in a lot of ways a 50-50 country. And so are people, does it motivate them? Is it like an afterthought? Are they excited that the decision happened? I guess a lot of it will depend on what neighborhood you're talking to, of course. Mm-hmm. But what is that beyond the, let's talk about it, like what's that underlying motivation behind it? Is it getting people fired up or?
Yeah. Well, I can say really easily, no one who has told me they're excited that the decision happened. Everybody is worried, concerned, they bring it up because, they're afraid. And some folks may not have followed the state politics enough to know that this decision won't impact their own reproductive choices here in Washington state yet. But folks are worried about what happens next. Is this the only, longstanding precedent that is overturned? Are there other things that they're coming for? They're worried about their grandkids, their children, their families' choices, their neighbors' choices. Hugely concerning. And even if it doesn't come up like the first thing that people are thinking about, often it'll come up later, because I work a lot in the healthcare space. So when I raise, issues of working on healthcare access, people say, oh my gosh, what I didn't think about when you first asked me is this, Roe decision, and how do we make sure that Washingtonians are protected? We've also seen a huge increase in organizing. We've had hundreds of folks in our district show up at rallies over the last week or so. And I was at an event in Seattle with 4,000 or 5,000 people on Saturday who are ready to organize and ready to make this an issue that changes the tide.
Hundreds of people in a state Senate race are turning out you're saying that they're turning out after the draft decision. I keep calling it the decision, but the draft decision. That's what's getting them out.
Yeah, we've had rallies. I organized a rally with some city council members on the Friday after the decision was leaked. There are folks organically just showing up with posters on busy street corners who are, demonstrating, who want folks to know that, we're not going to go backwards, that this is an issue that's important to them.
And it sounds like they're making the connections, not just like this is an isolated decision, but that it's a decision that could bleed into other areas of lives, that it's a decision that goes directly at privacy rights that then could spill over into, contraception or same-sex marriage. It sounds like they kind of have this slightly broader understanding of what's happening. Am I off on that, or?
No, I think that's right. Matt came with me knocking doors just the day or two after the decision was leaked. And we had a couple of folks who raised that right away. I'm worried about, Brown versus Board. I'm worried about Oberfell. I'm worried about these long-standing decisions and what that says about our liberties.
It's super informed. Super informed.
That's next layer, right? I mean, this is okay. Abortion rights are under the gun, but they're undermining the entire rationale for those, and people are getting that. That's amazing. Matt, you've been on the show a couple of times, and you've made the point that Democrats don't need to water down their message in order to be more competitive in these tough rural districts. And nobody's talking about winning them for the Democrats, but about eating into those margins that allow Republicans to offset Democratic performance in urban and increasingly suburban districts. How do you see this abortion issue playing in some of those rural districts that you're so passionate about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's fascinating to knock on doors with Emily and to see the response. I mean, the phrase that people kept using was slippery slope. As a person with a communications background, I always sort of listen for what's breaking through, and probably 5 or 6 houses. Well, one, the fact that people open the doors and everybody knows Emily. And a new thing that I've seen that I've never seen before is people want to talk through their Ring doorbells to somebody knocking on their door to talk about politics. I mean, we are at the level that people are at a Mariners game in Seattle and wanting to have a conversation through the Ring doorbell about Roe. So I don't know how we poll on that, but anecdotally, it does feel like there's a potential for a game changer, and with an organizing background, people have been exhausted. Like the Trump years were just absolutely exhausting. And a lot of people got involved through Indivisible or through their local activities. And you could just tell since last year, people just burned out. And I think this was I think a real reminder of the legacy of Trump. And that's, one of the reasons we are so focused on rural voters is because they just have such an outweighed impact on the Senate, which has an outweighed, obviously, impact on the Supreme Court. And so, our polling has always shown that, Democrats are getting about 35% of the rural vote. But when you ask, whether or not Roe should be overturned, you're looking at 57% of rural battleground voters who say Roe v. Wade should not be overturned. And so those margins, like if we get to just like high 40s, low 50s with rural voters, I am ecstatic. And whether you're talking about Roe or you're talking about the threat of violent white supremacists, rural people are so much closer to that 50-50 than they are to where the Republican position is at. So I think we have a lot of space in the margins. And I think that if you just look at the energy that is coming from the grassroots organizing as a result of the overreach from Republicans, there's I think a lot of ground to be gained in this space.
Do people understand that this is happening because of Republicans? I mean, do you think rural voters make that leap or not? I mean, and when you polled, obviously it hadn't happened yet. So I don't know what you're seeing. Like, we're all trying to gauge this in real time, right? Which is why we're talking to a state
2
senator
weeks.
a state senator who's like literally knocking on doors as we speak. Well, not as we speak, but that would be great. But anyway, great show. We just knock on someone's door. But anyway, so what are you seeing when you look at the fallout or the reaction or whatever in terms of rural voters? What are you seeing, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we've done a lot of polling and focus groups, and sometimes rural voters think Democrats are like, hyperbolic. And they say, oh, that will never happen. I mean, even in the sort of mainstream press, we were criticized for saying that, if Trump is elected, he'll overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, even up several weeks ago, we were sort of criticized for that. So whether it's things like what we're seeing here on abortion or, the stuff around the Great Replacement theory, I think it's a bit of a wake-up call for a number of Republicans or rural voters that, oh, when Republicans say this, they actually are serious because they're used to it just being rhetoric. And I think there's a big chunk, maybe 20, 30% of rural voters who kind of roll their eyes at that stuff and think, oh, it will never happen. Like, I'm not a huge Democrat fan. I don't like what, Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing, but the Marjorie Taylor Greenes don't really represent the Republican Party. So I think one of the biggest things that I've seen over the last couple of weeks is the wake-up call of like, oh no, that when they say this, they're serious. And I do think that changes the dynamic.
Yeah, God, it was a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, I wrote a book called American Taliban. And what I would do is I would take speeches from Republicans and from Taliban leaders, and I would strip it out of any cultural context. And I'd say, like, which one is it? Could they be railing against gay people? They'd be railing against women. And, it was like, okay, this could be anybody. And that's the way I sort of set it up. And I got more attacked by liberals and Democrats than I did by Republicans because I was being so hyperbolic, right? And of course now everything is playing out, and it sort of points to a problem that we've had. And Senator, I'm curious if you have this problem as you talk to people where you say this is what Republicans stand for. And it is just so not believable because nobody would think that a major American party would be so anti-democracy, that they would be so anti-people's choice. I mean, this is supposedly the smaller government party who literally wants to stick Ted Cruz in the doctor's office with you. And so, and then even issues of great replacement theory. Are they really that racist, right? Do you have a problem convincing people this is actually a thing, or you can't even do it because it's just so fantastically ridiculous a notion that nobody's going to believe it?
Yeah. So, I mean, as a candidate and a senator in my district, I don't spend a lot of time talking to folks about what capital R Republicans nationwide are doing. I am talking to people about, how we can change their lives here, what their fears are here, and what I can do to, help them build the kind of future that they want. I do sometimes and talk about, who their other choices, and especially when we've been talking about Roe, and it's not at all hyperbolic in my race because, my opponent introduces abortion bans, abortion restrictions every year that he's been in the legislature. He's, co-sponsored a ban on emergency contraception and, medication abortion. He's introduced 100% abortion ban with no, cases.
So he's in that 5% pocket.
We talked, right. We talked about that. 5% of the country. So, like in one of the polls supports that. So he's solidly within that 5%. Yeah. I mean, hey, I hate to tell you this, Senator, but you're not going to be able to get that 5%.
No, I like to lean into the persuasion as much as I can, but there are some folks that I agree are not persuadable.
Yeah. Yes. So that's the 5% he's got locked up. I don't know. Is that the type of thing that gets you to 50+1 is you just get that 5% locked up and you're good to go? That's it's rocket fuel from there. Just anyway, you don't have to answer my terrible questions.
So, hey, Matt, so sort of one of the problems, obviously, that Democrats have in these districts, and maybe even you, Senator, can speak to this, is that terrible brand that the Democrats have. That's fueled by the Republican Party and Fox News and talk radio and so on and so forth. And so there's, I question whether there's literally anything that can pierce that bubble. Now, of course, there's a 5% that is unpierceable, but we're still talking of another 45% that voted for the Republican in this district last 4 years ago in a good Democratic year. Let's not forget 2018 was a good Democratic year. And so is there anything, is abortion the magic bullet or anything else that can pierce that anti-democratic brand to give people a second look at an option that's not a Republican?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to underline the point, we did some polling last year that showed if you put a D next to a candidate's name, you lose 35 points in rural battleground communities. So it is a major challenge. I actually have started looking at another way and taking lessons from the undocumented or immigrant youth community and the gay community, that one of the biggest factors is, do you know a Democrat? And there is a persuasion that comes with knowing people who have been demonized in the press. And I think that in a lot of these rural communities, Democrats and progressives are told to just blend in. And in a lot of ways that can hurt us more than anything, because once you know a Democrat, you actually understand what they stand for. You can get the sort of long list of priorities, but also you can just know what it means to be a person. I mean, in my own family, I think when I started being a more kind of proud progressive Democrat, I brought family members with me that wouldn't have come with some sort of, argument from the, abstract position. So I do think that, if there's anything that will do it, I think it has to do with, I don't think there's a least popular thing Republicans could do than try and overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, I really don't. There's nuanced positions according to the polling where they could have done other things, but doing what they did was the worst thing they could do. And I think that we will pick up from that. And I think it also is that, and then on the ground organizing, getting the visible progressive Democrats out there, getting people, on the doors, introducing themselves. I think that's how you start overcoming the demonization that's coming from the media.
Yeah. And Senator, do you get a sense of any issues, whether it's abortion rights or something else that can pierce that bubble?
Yeah, I'd say healthcare is definitely one that folks trust Democrats more on. And that's, I don't lead with, I'm a Democrat when I knock on people's doors. I'm there to hear about what issues are important to them and find where we have common ground. But when people ask me, what your party is, or, why are you a Democrat? I say, because when my sister was born with special needs, when I was a little girl, it was Democrats in the Washington state legislature that expanded Medicaid and made sure Olivia could get the health care that she needed. And meanwhile, the other side of the aisle is trying to roll back healthcare protections. And, we all live in human bodies and we all need healthcare. And I'm for the party that's going to expand it to more people and make sure that we can afford to get the care that we need. And that, is certainly true now when we talk about abortion protections, ensuring that folks have life-saving, life-changing healthcare when they need it. And that, I think that resonates with people because we've all been sick. We've all seen high medical bills, especially folks in low-income communities are facing those challenges. And I think it's definitely a unifying issue.
But is that an issue that gets people that are already predisposed to vote Democratic, that motivates them to vote? Or is it something that actually may change some minds amongst, let's say, Fox News Republicans?
Yeah. So, our state, we don't have party registration unless you're voting for, in the presidential primary. So a lot of folks proudly don't identify as one party or the other. The folks I'm talking to at the doors, I'd say there's probably a higher number of people who identify as libertarians than there are, folks who identify as one party or the other. We've got a lot of folks who say they're an independent Democrat, a lot of self-identified moderates, folks who are ticket splitters, people who make decisions based on the issues. And I think that's important. It's certainly important in the way I represent my community, where I find common ground on issues. I think it persuades people to turn out and vote. And, maybe they'll vote for a down ballot Republican and me, and I'll take it. I want to make sure that I'm doing the best I can to represent my community in a way that makes people's lives better and isn't just partisan.
What do you find your GOP opponent is emphasizing right now? And has he been talking about abortion since this leaked news, or has he been ducking for cover?
Yeah. So protecting first responders is his number one message. What he has done to do that, I'll let folks research. But in fact, when he was asked by our local newspaper for a response on the abortion rallies that were happening around town, he says the Republican Party has long been the pro-life party, and that's why I support first responders.
Sounds like someone who doesn't particularly
left turn in that pivot.
Doesn't particularly want to talk about the issue. That's what that sounds like. Back to first responders. I support them.
Wow. But it actually really speaks to just how they're on shaky ground. It is really the dog that caught the car, doesn't know what to do with it. And even in a district where presumably there's a big rural population that would be more on the anti-abortion rights side, that they're not pressing the advantage. And we're definitely seeing this at the national level. I'm really surprised to see it at a district like this one, though.
Yeah, I think, our rural communities, I think a lot of people in our rural communities know someone who's had an abortion, who had an unexpected pregnancy themselves, who didn't have the money to afford to have another kid. A lot of folks are making the best decisions for themselves and their families. And maybe in our rural communities, people talk about it less. Maybe you're less likely to open up about this particular personal healthcare decision you had to make that was right for you and your family, and your economic future. But we know the data shows us that, 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 women are going to have an abortion or no. And more of us know people who have.
I had a quick question. I just want to comment real quick on that and say that has always been one of the challenges, I think, for the abortion rights movement, is that people don't readily want to talk about this. And one of the sea changes in the LGBTQ movement was that people came out and to their friends and family and kitchen table conversations around the country, and we saw that change the trajectory of the issue over the course of a generation, basically. But it's interesting to hear Matt talk about Democrats and people who don't know a Democrat because they're just blending in rural areas of the country. Matt, I wonder whether or not you think there are things. I mean, I feel like this seems like an issue that we want Democrats at the federal level to be pushing, because we would want other Republicans. I mean, we would want, Republicans in their districts, like who are running against the senator here, to have to grapple with it, right? Have to grapple with this national conversation. And I wonder what you think would be a potentially worthwhile way for Democrats to push this at the federal level, or do you disagree with me? I mean, there's this question about, is it worthwhile to have these messaging bills, right? These bills that, like, the Senate just took this vote on codifying Roe into law. Every Republican senator voted against it. All but one Democrat voted for it. I wonder if it would be worthwhile to have a messaging bill. And I don't think messaging bill kind of does it justice, but where we tried to codify protections just in the cases of rape, incest, and life of the mother, and get Republicans on record, voting against that bill, because that's something that is a position that the vast majority of Americans agree with, is that people should be able to make those healthcare decisions in those situations. So I just wonder, what do you think are the best ways to try and push this conversation at the federal level so that it stays top of mind for both voters and Republicans in the down ballot races have to sort of deal with it?
Yeah. So I think anything that shows how serious Republicans are about what they're saying is a good strategy. I mean, I would leave the specifics up to to the people who know the ins and outs of the policy and what risks are worth, taking and all that kind of stuff in terms of the strategy. But just in terms of where voters are at, I think the biggest struggle we have is there's another dynamic that, like, when rural voters hear about something good in their community, they think it's Republicans. So we're struggling with this with ARPA, where actually all this money is coming in. Historic amounts of money are coming into rural communities.
What ARPA is?
The American Rescue Plan Act.
Yeah.
So with the rescue plan, there's more money coming into rural communities than we've seen in a generation. But if you ask rural voters where that money is coming from, a lot of them just assume it's Trump, or they assume it's something their Republican governor did. So we need to be able to talk to voters, and we will never win Vox News watchers, Fox News Republicans. I mean, that's
Yeah,
not who we're focusing. Under 40 for women, under 35 for men in rural communities. And these are people that we're not trying to persuade them about Fox News. We're trying to persuade them about, caring about politics and that the decisions that they make about whether or not to vote will have an impact on their daily life. So we need legislation that reinforces that reality and actually shows where people stand. Because if you talk to members of Congress, they're so good about nuancing their position. Well, we can't do this, we can't do that. But until you get them on the record with a vote, it's really hard to nail them down. So I do think leaning into this, I think being strong and kind of bold in where we're at, I think is a smart strategy. We have an opposite problem. I think actually Republicans have that 5% that they keep catering to. Sometimes Democrats cater to a 5%, and that 5% tends to be a little bit more of the donor class or sort of the corporate Democrat who is more, more concerned about.
I was wondering where you were going with that.
All those liberals, they're horrible.
Yeah, no, but there is a pundit class of Democrat that loves talking about rural voters and has never lived in a rural community, never experienced rural life. And they don't understand that progressive policies are actually very, very popular, especially anti-corporate progressive policies. And so the watering down that happens with the message is hurting us on both fronts, because we're losing on the brand ID, we're losing on the Democratic brand, which people don't like. And then we lose on the policy, but because they actually like our policies, but they don't see Democrats pursuing those policies. So we turn into this situation of where we're kind of all talk and no action, and we lose people on both fronts. So I think that messaging bills are smart. I think that doing it here is especially smart. And I think that I'm really hoping that we see some action on it. So,
Senator, I mean, it's actually that same question, but in Washington state itself, I suspect people are more plugged into what's happening in DC, to the extent that they're plugged into anything at all, than maybe what's happening in, is the capital of Washington Spokane?
Olympia.
Oh man, how embarrassing is that?
Spokane wishes.
But so are people? Is there anything you can do in Olympia itself? Because we have a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor. Is there anything on that front that penetrates into a district like yours, or is it mostly what's happening in DC that people are listening to?
No, folks are definitely persuaded by the policy that we've been pushing in Washington, as we so often call it. That to the extent that they learn about it, and some of our data shows us that people are more tuned in this last session than they have been, in previous sessions about the policy, that's being passed. Certainly about abortion rights. When people hear and learn, they're really excited that Washington has taken every step we can over the last 5 years since we retook control of the state Senate to protect access and strengthen access to abortion. We passed a big policy this year that continues to protect providers, protect folks who are assisting people in accessing abortion. But we have, more to do, definitely. And an issue that's really important to my neighbors is access to secular healthcare. In Washington state, we have one of the highest concentrations of Catholic affiliated hospitals in the country. In my district, in my county, in Kitsap County, you have, unless you are have access to the Naval Hospital, you don't have access to secular hospital beds. The only abortion clinic is a Planned Parenthood clinic that serves not just our county, but multiple counties around the area that don't have any other access. So, I have a policy that I've worked on the last couple of years. We haven't passed yet, that gives our Attorney General review authority for mergers and acquisitions. It's not just about access to secular care, but it's definitely about access to secular care. It's also about, the cost that's being driven up for consumers when, big conglomerates are acquiring healthcare facilities and making decisions not about local patients, but about, their bottom line. And so that's one that's really firing people up, to make sure that we are ensuring access to care, not just legal, right to care, but real access in our communities. And there's also been some conversation when we talk about messaging policy about a constitutional amendment to protect access and ensure access to reproductive health care in Washington.
Would that go to the voters?
That would have to go to the voters, yeah.
Well,
That's a good
that
one.
would be I was going to say that would seems to me like it would potentially drive out voters if that were on the ballot.
Yeah. So, Matt, what's your overall? How are you feeling about the midterm elections, particularly in your sort of world in that rural space? Is there actually? I mean, obviously, there was this fear that Democratic performance would be going down. There's sort of evidence that that's increasing, including here anecdotal on the ground reports from the senator's district that people are getting fired up. Do you get any sense that Democrats are making gains in rural areas, or is it going to be we're going to have to really get our base out in urban areas, convince those fickle college-educated suburban white women to vote Democratic, and then hope that maybe Republicans don't turn out in numbers they've been in areas that's been the last several cycles. Can we break out of that cycle?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's a both and strategy. So I think first, absolutely, we need to turn out the base in urban areas. So I will never advocate for a rural exclusive or rural only strategy. I think that's just, goes against, any sort of strategic look at the numbers, but also just, I think anytime there's an urban rural divide, I think it really just hurts, both communities. So I think we need a both and approach. And I think that's something that I have seen. And for me specifically, that's looking at the rural piece of that strategy. I think there are some members of Congress that are taking a new approach for rural communities, not just doing the sort of what would be called the big ag strategy, focusing on, frankly, the farmers who have millions and millions of dollars of equipment and land, but actually focusing on the real rural America, which is, heavily focused on the service economy, and it involves a lot more people working in education and healthcare, and it's much more diverse than I think people really realize. There's actually more farm workers than small family farmers in rural America. So there are some Democrats that are starting to understand, I think, what I would call a more accurate picture of rural America, and you're starting to see that with legislation. I think it feels sometimes like it's too little too late. So I do wonder how much of this is going to be impacting the 2022 cycle. And I try and remind people it took 30 years to get into this mess, and we're not going to fix it overnight. But I'm starting to see a new approach, a new paradigm, a new focus from Democrats. And I think that's the really exciting first step. But we absolutely need to be turning out the base. And the last thing I'll say about the suburbs, because I think there is some focus on the suburbs. The suburbs are changing. So it's not just that white people in the suburbs are changing their mind. The suburbs are becoming more diverse. So I do think that there's a lot of opportunities in the suburbs as well, especially among younger voters and voters of color.
Senator, can I ask just, I think we're gonna have to let you go soon, but can I ask one last question? What do you, does it help you to have the Democrats at the federal level do anything in particular? What would you like to see from them? Or does that not impact your state level race very much?
Well, I think folks are certainly tuned into what's happening at the federal level. People are much more likely to see those news headlines than, things that we do more locally. I feel really lucky that we have the champion that we do in Senator Patty Murray. She has long been an advocate for strengthening reproductive rights nationwide, and has worked hard, here when she was in office locally too, to be a champion. And while I was certainly disappointed in the vote on the Women's Health Protection Act, we sort of knew it was coming, and now we've got folks on the record. I think the more that they can fight for the rights that we all deserve, the better. And I'll be focused on what we do here locally to make sure that people know about the protections that we're passing as well.
Oh, hey, Marcos, you're muted there.
Jesus Christ! How many years of Zoom meetings and okay, I'm really having a moment here. Don't know the capital of Washington. Didn't unmute my mic. Woo. Senator, since we are out of time, what can people do to help you win your race? And how far away are you from Seattle, so people that may not otherwise have something going on may be able to drive down and help you out?
Yeah. So we're about an hour drive from
Oh,
Seattle,
totally
an
easy.
hour slow ferry ride. You can take a fast ferry too on the weekdays.
And
a
it's
half an
beautiful.
hour
It's
walk
a
on.
beautiful ferry.
Yeah, beautiful ferry ride. Sometimes you see a whale, sometimes you see a submarine.
Oh,
Cool.
It's always interesting. So you can visit our website at electemilyrandall.com to sign up for volunteer opportunities, to kick us up some cash if you can afford it. Follow us on social media at Emily Randall WA on all the things, the Twitter, the TikTok, the Facebook, the Instagram. And would love to take you out and knock doors with me. Matt can attest I'm a fun walking buddy. And it's really interesting when you get into conversations with people, on their front porch about, you often have more in common than you thought.
That's awesome. Matt, same question for you. What can people do to help you achieve your mission to eat into those Republican margins in urban districts?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, support strong local candidates, I think is the first thing. And you can find our work at ruralorganizing.org, and we're on Twitter and Facebook with the Rural Organizing username. So we'd love to connect with people there. But I do have to say, we're a national group. We do a lot of work on the national level. It's very important to get involved locally. And I think especially your point about if you're in Seattle, kind of going out to the surrounding areas, but that's true across, kind of all the major metros.
Yes.
There's a lot of people on the outskirts of town, I think, that would really appreciate the help.
Yeah, and even outskirts of states, I always say, like, if you're in Chicago, there's a lot going up in Wisconsin. You might want to take a trip up there and help out. Absolutely critical for everybody to be engaged. And I think almost everybody has a race within an hour drive. Oh,
New York, they can go to Pennsylvania. I mean, I did that when I was there, or I covered people who did that. Yeah.
You're in California, you got Arizona, you got Nevada. I mean, everybody's got something nearby that they can actually go out and help one. Senator Emily Randall of Washington State, thank you so very much for joining us. Matt Hildreth, he's the executive director of ruralorganizing.org. You guys are amazing. You're doing God's work. Thank you so much. Whew. Carrie, that gives me hope. That gives me hope.
Yeah.
I mean, and not just that people were plugged into the draft decision, but that they understand that it's not just about abortion rights. The abortion rights issue, I never want to minimize how important that is.
Right.
But this is a decision that, assuming it stands, and all indications are that Alito has the votes to let the legal underpinning survive. That means that gay rights are on the chopping block, access to contraception, even laws banning interracial marriage could be upheld with his reasoning. And then there's even the even broader picture where Alito says that this is not a real right because it did not exist when the Constitution was written. So basically he's saying, unless you're a white male property owner, you do not have any rights. And now he does say, if you don't like it, you can vote. Like, he comes out and he literally says, because he's sensitive to the idea that he's a man taking away a right from women. And so he's like, well, if women don't like it, they're more than capable of voting. And I think we really need to make sure that people understand that invitation and graciously
absolutely, because I've always wanted an invitation from Justice Alito to get to the polls, and I've been waiting for years, and now I get to make good on that. I think one thing that that Matt brought up that he was hearing is this slippery slope argument in terms of messaging. People were actually using that phrase. He was saying that they were using that phrase. And I think that's really interesting because slippery slope is something that everybody kind of understands, and the right has been using it on certain issues like the Second Amendment and gun rights and whatever forever. I mean, the NRA is the biggest slippery slope, pusher.
Oh, yeah.
In America, probably, but yeah. Hey, look, if it's time for us to turn that phrase around and use it for good, rather than try to push more Second Amendment rights so that people can get slaughtered across the country, which, by the way, is huge topic recently. I mean, it's just like unbelievable. Let's just pause for a second to have a moment for all those people in at what it was called
in Buffalo.
in Buffalo,
Yeah.
New York, the Tops
And
supermarket.
in Southern California too.
Yeah, in Southern California too. Let's just pause for a second. I mean, that just listening to those folks, I listened to some interviews. It's just dreadful. But anyway, I think this slippery slope argument is a good one on abortion, because that's exactly what it is. This the way that opinion was written by Alito, it is absolutely a slippery slope into all sorts of privacy rights.
Yeah, and I'm frankly, I'm surprised people get it. Like, she didn't have to make the argument. People instinctively understand what's
Yeah.
happening. And so it gives Democrats, like we said, they're pissed off that this thing was leaked, because it gives Democrats an extra month to organize around it and to test different messages and to see just how people are going to react and adjust our campaigns accordingly. Carrie, we have just, oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to bring up one thing that I wrote on last week, which is, one thing that's going to happen is once this decision comes down, then there's going to be this, immediately a number of at least a dozen or more red states that will have, that will have very radical bans go into place. And
Immediately.
some of those,
Immediately.
I mean, half the nation is going to have states are going to have immediately bans go into place, but some of them are going to be more draconian than others. And some of those attorneys general in the red states are going to go after, they're going to try to, punish, they're going to try on people for getting abortions, for performing abortions. And I just want to, Politico Morning Consult polled this last week. And here's how that goes over with the electorate. Prison time for women who get abortions is supported by 16% of people, with 73% opposing. Fines for women who get abortion, supported by 22% of people, 66% oppose. Prison time for doctors who perform abortion, 22% support, 68% support, 68% oppose. And fines for doctors who perform abortions, this polled best, this was their best, was 29% support.
Not even a third.
1% opposed. Not even a third. So this is when this happens, and it is going to happen. There's going to be this slew of stories across the country about criminalizing abortion, also some very heart-wrenching stories about people losing lives and things like that. And this is not, it's going to get worse unless a bunch of red state attorneys general decide we're not going to enforce these right away, which I highly doubt. That's not going to happen. There's going to be horrific stories, and they're not just going to be local. That it's going to be it's going to be just a cascade of, they always say in journalism, the story is never dog bites man, it's man bites dog, right? Yeah. And all of these stories that are going to come out are going to be of the nature of man bites dog, cascading on and on about abortion for, months to come. And that is going to harden public opinion and people's will to go to the polls in November.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you brought that up, because I have in front of me a sort of messaging memo from the Democratic House Pro-Choice Caucus. And one of the things that they're saying is, don't talk about back alley abortions, don't talk about coat hangers, talk about criminalizing healthcare. And that poll is exactly the reason why. Criminalizing healthcare viscerally upsets people. And remember, a big chunk of Republicans say they're Republican because they're small government conservatives, right? And by criminalizing healthcare, you're literally inserting government in people's private decisions. Also on this list, two more bullet points that I think are kind of interesting is, instead of saying choice, ironic from the pro-choice caucus, instead of saying choice, talk about decision. It's not a choice. It's a decision. It's not a choice if you're on top of a building to jump off or not. That's not a choice. These are situations that women are forced to make a decision that can be very, very difficult for many. And so choice makes it sort of trivializes it. It's blue or red this morning. Should I dye my hair green or blonde? No, it's not a choice. This is actually a momentous decision. And so it's a decision between a woman and her doctor. Republicans want to criminalize that. And they also say, don't talk about unwanted pregnancy. Talk about unexpected pregnancy. Because nobody willfully gets unwantedly pregnant, right? I mean, it's just like, it's always an oh shit in those situations, right? It's like unexpected. And so you're forced to make a decision between you and your doctor on how to proceed. And so there is an irony to the pro-choice caucus saying don't call it choice anymore, but it sort of makes sense. And you know that they poll tested this, the focus group tested it, and some of these like criminalizing healthcare clearly. I mean, it's just so polls remotely off the charts. But talking about Ted Cruz being in that room with you and your doctor,
right?
That's powerful stuff.
Right.
Nobody wants Ted Cruz anywhere.
Right. He's inserting himself into your family's decisions. Yeah, that's exactly Ted Cruz.
So that is all the time we have today. I really do think we're going to be talking about this issue quite a bit, Carrie. It is critically important as a right, and it's going to have, I think, a big impact on this election in ways that I don't think we fully quite understand yet. And everybody who's listening, read Carrie Eleveld at Daily Kos, because she is doggedly covering this story. I think it's the story of this electoral cycle, and will probably decide who has control of Congress. And who has control of Congress will decide not just the abortion issue, will decide whether we have a functioning democracy moving forward. So incredibly important. Carrie, thank you so much for always being the best co-host. Thanks to the whole Brief team, Paul, Walter, Kara, Dorothy, and Carolyn for all your work to make the show run. Thanks to our guest today, Senator Emily Randall of Washington, and Matt Hildreth, Executive Director of ruralorganizing.org. And thank you, our viewer, listener, for joining us this week to talk about these important issues. Our democracy at stake this November. So glad that you're by our side in this fight, existential fight for our American democracy. Thank you so much. See you next week.